Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. How do you read scripture faithfully, especially when you read it in a long format, like, reading from Genesis to Revelation? Some people do this. It's really valuable to read scripture in this long way, but you have to overcome something to do it well. And that is the idea of phony originalism, the idea of history versus myth. Now, I'll back up a little bit and say, now, do you have an image of a traditional past that was better than it is today? Kids, they respected parents back then. People had manners. They respected the law, unlike we do. Neighbors watched out for each other, not like the wicked times that we are in, the reasoning goes. And this harkening back to this mythical past is just so strong in society today. We see it, but it's actually always true. If you look through history, you read uh, historical texts, you read philosophers. Since the ancient Greeks, we've heard things about those kids today. They're not like us. And this reach back for originalism is always part of us. Now, you may think, well, what does that have to do with the Bible? Well, it has a lot to do with religion in general because, by its very nature, being religious is a hearkening to being traditional, to having a traditional belief, at least the way we see it. And religious people in general have a strong affinity, a trend, or a tendency toward being traditionalist. And that's especially true in Christianity for sure. We see it more in Christianity in America than in most other religions because Christianity is the dominant religion, and we have a lot of national myth around being Christian in Western cultures, like we do. But it's certainly true with Muslims. You definitely have your traditionalists and your non, and of course we're very aware of that. I mean, there's a billion people there that you're dealing with, so you're going to have definitely a large portion of them being traditionalists, but certainly true in Asia with Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, all these religions, of course. You tend to have this thing about originalism. And you go, well, where does that come from? Where does that idea of creating a myth about the past that you think the past was better than it, historically was for sure, and certainly you think it's better than today? I would say that this drives, almost a very large portion of the conservative movement in the United States that we see, especially in politics, is that there's this strong myth about a better past. And but when you look through history, you just don't see that at all. Um, there are a couple of ways I think that we can see it a little bit outside of our own context, and we can see then how it applies to us. I should say that, of course, it's true in society in general. There's a very strong movement, especially in legal circles, this idea of originalism, or what is often called textualism, which is kind of a judicial philosophy of being text only, has very strong Protestant roots, even though, we have a lot of Catholics also in the judiciary, but that are traditionalists. But this idea of if we just got back to something original, and that is huge in Protestantism, right? This idea of sola scriptura and the five solas, that Protestants have, is this idea of if we can just go back to the faith that they had, in the first century, then we'd be a whole lot better off. We'd be a lot more faithful. So it's really everywhere in society. So what I'd like to do then is I'd like to talk a little bit about ancient Israel and where this comes from. A lot of this originalism that we have, especially in America, has to do with urbanization and with all of the changes in society. We tend to look back to a time when life was simpler on the farm, when we didn't have all of this technology that we were dealing with. We didn't have these big city morals or lack of morals, because you see a lot of the division that we have in America has to do with those big city people not understanding us rural people. Now, I live, at least part of the time, I live in Oregon. And I was in Eastern Oregon last week visiting some of the sites out there. And wow, you go to, places like John Day, Oregon, you go to uh, places like Burns or Pendleton, you go to Eastern Washington. I mean, that's basically like your rural Alabama, as far as the political and religious views of things. And you go, well, gee, why do you have so many more people like this who sort of harken back to sort of this idea of, original, the past being better in these locations? Well, a lot of it has to do with the power of urbanization and the fact that so many people have moved to urban areas, and they see that as a threat. Where they're sort of the old ways are quote dying. Now, of course, people you have a lot of people in urban areas that also think this way too, right? For sure. And you have traditionalists in urban areas, but that's generally what you're seeing. You see societies that are very mixed racially, religiously, in urban areas, and of course, in most rural areas in the United States, you don't have nearly that mixture or exposure there. And I really want to be careful. You never want to say one is better than the other. You just have to realize, why do people feel the way they do? And why do we have these differences between more conservative people, more liberal people, more progressive people? Why do we have these differences between urban and rural? The reason why this is important for ancient Israel has a very direct uh, correlation with a lot of the narrative that you see in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament as well, but especially in the Old Testament. One of the professors I had in seminary is a PhD student. He was a PhD student at UCLA in 2020, and he is a PhD with Eastern languages and cultures. His name is Jason Price, Dr. Jason Price. He was a professor at my seminary, George Fox in Oregon, and he has done tons of research on the difference between the communities which are settled in Israel, meaning the farmers, especially around the Jezreel Valley in the north, but throughout the plains of Israel, and the herders, the people who are in the mountains, especially in the mountains of Judah, and how that plays centrally into the narrative that we see in Scripture, and why we see a tendency toward uh, Judah or Judahite or Judean, later became Judean, supremacy in Scripture. When you read, especially what we see as the Deuteronomists' history, going up through Samuel and Kings, especially, what you're seeing a Judean interpretation uh, of what happened over the previous centuries. You have to remember that Israel was only consolidated as a unified kingdom in the time of Saul, David, and Solomon. So maybe a century, perhaps, around 1000 BCE, 900 BCE. And you see that in this time, it's spoken about as a unified Israel. Now, what we know about Moses and the 12 tribes of Israel crossing over, Joshua and the conquering of Canaan, uh, th- that is all seen through a Judahite lens mostly, and what was written about that. So there is a sense that Israel was always unified in the 12 tribes, but even in the narrative of Joshua, and you can see it in Deuteronomy and the way Moses dealt with the tribes. You can see how there was always this tension. The tribes were always separate, trying to separate from each other. We read about the 12 or the two and a half tribes that stayed on the east side of the Jordan River and refused to go to across the Jordan, and they had to be coaxed to help the other tribes to conquer Canaan. So where did that come from? And you read the last half of the book of Joshua, which is generally very hagiographic, very like propaganda for the most part. But you see a little bit of realism come through in the last part of Joshua because they almost go to civil war over this, and the tribes continued to do this. So when, but they worked well enough together, and they were unified under Judah kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And it was David that conquered the Jebusites to create the city of David, which is Jerusalem. So that was a consolidation of power in Jerusalem. The reason why, and what we see throughout the Old Testament, is we see the tension between the consolidation in the temple in Jerusalem and the northern tribes who tended to look to Bethel and Shechem, which are the Mount Gerizim in the north. That's where they look to uh, you know um, uh, Elijah. They look to Joshua. They look to Abraham. That's where he was. So why did we talk so much about Jerusalem when really so much of Israelite history happened even before Jerusalem even was established as the center of Judah under David? Well, this all speaks to something that Dr. Price talks about extensively. The fact is that in the north, those were farmers. Most of the tribes that we're talking about, that were the 10 tribes, were in, and they centered their power in the Jordan Valley, which is broad and flat, around the Sea of Galilee, and the plains of Sharon, but especially the Jezreel Valley. Jezreel Valley goes from Haifa down to the Jordan River. On the south side, it's famous for having Megiddo, which uh, 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 becomes Armageddon later in Scripture. On the north side, you have Mount Tabor, and you have Nazareth, which are of course also very important in biblical history. And it's this broad valley, and it's the breadbasket. It's well watered up there, much more so than in the south. Uh, and it's also along the routes that if you were wanting to go from north of Israel in Syria and uh, the Hittite Empire, where the Assyrians were around Euphrates and Nineveh, and you wanted to get to Egypt, or vice versa, if you were Egyptian and you wanted to go north, you went through the plains of Sharon and the Jezreel Valley, because those were naturally there. So here you have this land that's so valuable, so fertile, that gets between 20 close to 30 inches of rain a year, and you compare that to the hills, 80 miles south, where Judah is. You go, oh, well, it's drier down there, especially when you get into the valleys. It's drier. It's not as fertile. You don't have the big broad valleys in the south. And as you get south of Jerusalem and you go toward Beersheba and places like this, it's in the Negev desert. I mean, it's desert. As you get toward the bottom of the Dead Sea, Masada and south, it's desert, desert, desert. So you can see the big change there. So what we're mostly reading about in Scripture, especially in uh, the the Deuteronomists portion of the Old Testament, is you're reading about the tension between these northern tribes, which are farmers mostly, and the southern tribes, especially Judah, who became dominant over time, who are herders. Now, of course, they had farming in the south as well, but it was primarily a herding culture. This is why we read about David and the sheep. You can tell, people who were in the north were richer, and when things were good. So we read about in the book of Amos, all the screeds against the Bashan, which is the Golan Heights area, and all of those people up in the north. Well, mostly this is a guy from Judah, Amos, complaining about how these people in the north have become rich and lazy and mistreated people. And he's also describing the fact that because that land is so valuable in the north, that's why the Assyrians came down and conquered it. Everybody wanted that valley. In fact, there's a great narrative in about King Josiah at the end of Second Kings and also in Second Chronicles about the Egyptians going around Judah to fight with the Assyrians and Neo-Babylonians in the north of Israel, and Josiah goes up to meet King or Pharaoh Necho, and he says, Necho goes, well, why are you bothering with me? I went around you. This isn't your fight. Um, but the reason why the Egyptians thought that way is because they didn't need Judah. Judah was in the hills. It was hard to conquer, too. A lot of the supremacy of Judah in later centuries, a lot of the reason why Judah or the northern tribes, Israel, was conquered in 722 by the Assyrians, 722 BCE, and that Judah and Jerusalem lasted another 140 years or so before getting conquered by the Babylonians. A lot of that had to do with the fact that, number one, uh, there wasn't much value in Judah. It was drier, it's desert, it's pasture land, it's mountainous, and there was great value in the north, uh, because it's broad, fertile plains. The other part was it's harder to conquer. When you have farmers, and this Jason Price does a great job of this, he describes the mentality of a farmer versus the mentality of a shepherd. The mentality of a farmer is you have to build cities, fortifications, you have to build up weapons, you have to have a military in order to survive in a agricultural community, because you're stationary, you're tied to the land, you armies can come through and conquer you, so you're going to develop the structures to protect yourself from that. If you're up in the mountains and you're in a citadel, which is essentially Jerusalem, you go to Jerusalem today, it looks like a big, citadel on a hill, and that's what it was. Then you, your ability to defend your territory is way easier, As herders, you can escape into the hills, you can hide. Your food goes with you, you know, as long as you can find water and pasture, you're good, right? You're not tied to the land in the same way. So, to me, if you can read, when you read the Old Testament, always ask yourself, am I reading the words of herders? Am I reading the words of farmers? And most of, like I said, what the Deuteronomists wrote, Genesis, most of Genesis, all the way through Second Kings, is written by uh, um, people in Judah, from Judah, the Deuteronomists. They're written by herders. They're written by people who want to consolidate the religion in the one temple in Jerusalem. And they think all of these other worshiping in the high places is apostasy. So that's why you read that. So how does that relate to originalism? I think that relates to originalism a lot with, if you look on the different sides, it's the people who were farmers who were pushed out of their land may have had the glory, a sense of the glory days before we got conquered. The same thing could be, and you see a lot in scripture, is that if you were just faithful like we are in Jerusalem, this is sort of King Josiah's point of view, right? His father Amon and his grandfather Manasseh were trying to consolidate a larger group of areas. That's why they kept appeasing these other groups of people, and they were seen as bad, right? Because they weren't pure like we people in Jerusalem. That's the way they thought, the Deuteronomists thought. So um, this is, you get a sense of that's why if you're traditional, you had it good and you feel under threat, then you're going to give in to this idea of a phony originalism. This idea of originalism meaning developing a myth about the past. Now, of course, people do that today a lot. We look back to the 1950s. Many sort of middle class white people look back, who are originalists, who are traditional conservative, look back to the 50s as a good time, right? They don't realize that in that time we also had McCarthy, which was very reactionary. We had a lot of people at the time were very mad about Eisenhower. They thought President Eisenhower was going to come in and get rid of those terrible New Deal, socialist ideas from Roosevelt. And then when Eisenhower didn't do that, that made people really mad, especially the Christian fundamentalists, right? And then they put themselves behind Goldwater, right? And then you kind of develop over time, over the last 80 years in America, we have developed this myth of this idea of when America was on top of the world, and we had the nuclear family, and we had respect for each other, and so forth. But you have to realize that that was an amalgamation of this idea of small town America, this idea before lots of urbanization happened, suburban areas, which were very racially uniform at the time. It was before civil rights and all the problems of that people felt very threatened by things like desegregation and busing and all of those things. The women's movement, the sexual revolution, all of those things have caused people to feel very uncomfortable. And then you have this harkening back to a more traditional era. You also find that it comes and goes. So, certainly during the Reagan era, you definitely had a feeling of traditionalism, but there was a sense of security around that because, hey, we've got a more traditionalist view of America in the White House, and we certainly have that today, kind of a redo of that. Make America Great Again is essentially phony originalism. It's harkening back to a past that really didn't exist, or our vision of what that past is. Very much tied to a religion. So that's why I talk about you can see how that originalism, that harkening back, lives with us all the time. And we as human beings, we look back in that it definitely is a big part of the narrative of the Old Testament. It's also a part of the New Testament. When you look at Pharisees, for example, now we tend to think of Pharisees being bad, legalistic, all of that, because Jesus opposed them. But the Pharisees were also engaged in originalism, right? They wanted a more pure Judaism. They thought that the people, the temple hierarchy in Jerusalem were corrupted by the Romans. They were making compromises with the Romans. So, yeah, sure. Now, when Jesus talked about it, you can see that the Pharisees and Jesus were kind of talking on the same side most of the time, because Jesus also was saying, we got to we got to be one with, I'm one with the Father. I want you to be one with the Father too, against this religious hierarchy in Jerusalem that's oppressing us, that's not standing up for us. So you can see how they're allied in that way. And that's true for what we say. I think that this is the central challenge of the church in the coming decades. A central challenge, especially for the mainline church. The reason why is, uh, and I, as a Presbyterian pastor, I see this all the time. There's this tension between the good old days. I have mainline churches are filled with people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? They remember the 50s and 60s. They remember when people put a tie on to go to church. They remember that kind of uh, security that they had, and they have built a phony a narrative about that, and saying it was so much better. Of course, because for them when they were in charge, it was better, maybe for them, right? Um, and then you also see but the mainline churches have largely moved beyond and have reckoned with things that other Christians have not. So, in my church, for example, we're fully inclusive of LGBTQ people. We are fully honoring of women in all levels of structure, of all levels of service in the church. Now, different denominations are different parts of that path, right? My daughter is a Nazarene pastor, so the Nazarenes have had women in ministry for 130 years. So it's not like something new to them at all. But the Nazarenes are more conservative about things like sexuality, so they are not affirming. And so you can kind of see that we're on this path and that we're moving. So the question today is, why does the mainline church have this inability to integrate younger people into church? Why is it that there has been some success in more evangelical churches in attracting younger people? Part of this is an illusion. Part of it is what we've seen as the megachurch movement of the last 30, 40 years. And that by having sort of more entertainment based, by having new technology, by having a more simple theology, a more hardline theology in some cases, that has attracted some young people. But by and large, the bigger trend is that young people have not found a place in the church, and that's why we've seen a reduction of church membership, and why we've seen such a big increase of the nuns, the people who are not religiously affiliated at all. Um, where are they going to go? Are they going to go hardline? Are they going to go to a kind of Christianity that does not honor all people, is the mainline church, which has made that transition, going to become attractive again? And we don't know. There are plenty of people in mainline Christianity that have a lot of phony originalism too. There are plenty of liberal people that have phony originalism. And so part of this is an exercise in getting to know what your bias is and where it comes from. So I'll close with with a kind of an interesting other way of looking at that, which is scriptural. I was asked earlier this week. Somebody said, "Should I read scripture from Genesis to Revelation? You know, take a year or whatever, and just read it straight through." And I said, "Sure." But they said, "Well, do you recommend that?" And I go, "Well, let me tell you what I think about reading scripture in long format like that. It's generally a wonderful thing to do because if you read all of scripture, then you will appreciate its messiness, its craziness. You'll appreciate that a lot of the things that most people say, like as I do, that people say are in scripture aren't really there. You will definitely learn that if you read scripture faithfully, but it's hard to do to read it straight through. So I said, get to know the Gospel of John first. If you really know John as a Christian, and you learn how to read John objectively, in other words, read it with Jewish eyes, for example, or non Christian eyes, it will help you a lot in preparing to read the Old Testament. And the person that I spoke to about this was really puzzled. Why? What does that have to do with anything? I said, one of the things about John is nowhere in John does it say Jesus is God. Now it does say Jesus is the Word. It does say that Jesus has many the I am statements. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. I am the good shepherd. But Jesus, the equating of God the Father and Jesus, or having them be the same, is a more modern concept. It came out, that we've developed the doctrine of the Trinity. We developed this a whole theology that we lay on the text of John. Now, John is the basis for a lot of our of our theology. But if you can read John like a Jewish person does, because it's really valuable, John contains, in my opinion, but I think in the opinion of most scholars, contains the best examples of early rabbinic discourse in the Bible. This idea, this sort of verbal jujitsu that you see Jesus engage with the Pharisees. You do see it definitely in other places as well, but those are so illuminating, the way they go back and forth and how rabbinic discourse happens. So if you can read John like a Jewish person reads John, and in fact, I recommend the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which was edited by uh, Zevi Bretler and Amy Jill Levine, who are both Jewish. Super, super valuable to get it from that perspective. If you're able to do that, then you can go back to reading Genesis through, and the whole Bible without all of the atonement theories. Because most Christians, when they read the Old Testament, they tend to read Genesis literally, for example, which, most Jewish people do not, definitely don't read it literally. Uh, they read it more as a collection of stories demonstrating who God is, whereas Christians have, especially sola scriptura Christians, have tended to go, no, this is a narrative, it's like a novel, you read it linearly, right? But if you can take those atonement theory ideas out, the ideas of what sacrifice is, and get rid of the idea that all of this is pointing to Jesus, it can help you really understand the Old Testament from their point of view. And you can remove a lot of the originalism, a lot of the ideas that we've laid on the Old Testament. You see how that works? It's not much different than us engaging with the history of the 20th century. In order to do a faithful job of, looking at the early 20th century, or even looking, say, at the history of the Reformation, reevaluating colonialism and the slave trade, all of those things. If you can take the more recent history, in order to do that faithfully, you have to get rid of some of your preconceived notions that the myth that we as Americans have made of sort of myth making in order to, uphold what we believe. It's the same thing in the Bible too. If you can, now, like I said, myth making is not bad. Theology is not bad. You just have to realize that it's there. You just have to realize that that is our tendency to do that. So that's what I'm saying here is that that's why I think in order to faithfully read the Old Testament, you have to be able to separate what you were taught, what your theology is, from the text to some degree. You can't do it. You can't do it completely because we are humans, right? But that's why I say John is such a great test case. If you can read John and say to yourself, "Oh, yeah, there is nothing in John that says Jesus is God." That the Jesus is God is is what how we interpret the text in later centuries and as Christians. But if you can read it as a Jewish person reads it, you can see it quite differently. Again, if you can apply that to the Old Testament. So that with that, I'll say um, the Bible says lots of things that are, or people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, especially when it comes to originalism, especially to the idea of taking our theologies, especially the theologies that have been developed in the last couple hundred years as Protestants, and laying it on texts that are 2,500 years old or older. Then if you can not do that, it really opens up a lot of doors, and you can see a lot of other things, and it really opens your mind. And then you can say, "Oh, that's why I believe what I do. That's why my neighbor is acting the way they are. That's why we're going through all of the difficult transitions as a country, as a people." Are going through. And not just, and I realize that some of you are outside of the United States, even though most of you are here. But I mean, throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout the rest of the world, we're all dealing with this concept. We're all dealing with a rise of authoritarianism. We're all dealing with this concept of, our fascism, populism, all of those things around the world. A lot of it has to do with this idea of this phony originalism. That's the fuel for the populism that we're seeing around the world, especially fascism. Fascism requires phony originalism in order to be able to thrive. Authoritarianism requires it. So I think that if you're able to read and step back from that and realize where it comes from, it can really help. So with that, I say thank you and God bless you.